Hi, so I thought I'd show you today how to do a self-binding, I think that's how we'd call it, of something like a placemat or a coaster. Today we're going to do a coaster because it's small and achievable today. So I've got the same fabric on the back as I've got for my binding, and I can alter the width of my binding or what looks like a binding here. So I'm just going to show you how to do that. It's not quite the same as just having the backing and bringing it to the front. We are effectively doing that, but we're going to sew our little mitered corners in so that they're already in place for us. So probably you wouldn't want to use this on a large quilt because it would be quite tricky to get all that working with a large quilt, but smaller items like coasters, placemats, mug mats, things like that, it works really nicely on. So you can alter the size of this binding, as I mentioned. Today this one is approximately 1 inch wide, so that's what I'm going to show you today, but if you wanted it wider, there's ways to do that, so I'll talk about that as we go. So I've started out with a 5-inch square and batting, so this is a great way to use up some leftover squares, some leftover bits and pieces of batting. You don't want anything too bouncy for batting if it's going to be a coaster. I'm using a cotton, or sometimes I use a lot of cotton blend batting, so it's nice and sort of firm and not too thick and bouncy, so it works really well for this sort of thing. I was going to make some placemats, and you can make nice sets, placemats and coasters or mug mats. What wonderful gifts they'd be. So I've got my 5-inch square of batting, I've got my 5-inch square of fabric. That's going to be where I've got the light colour here, that's my centre. And then I've cut, to make the binding, I've cut my backing fabric, which is this green. I've cut that 2 inches larger all round than my centre, so that I end up with a 1-inch binding. So it's double the width of the binding to do it this way. So this was 5-inch, so this makes this 9-inch. So it's 2 inches here and 2 inches here all the way around. Now we just need to mark the corners so that we can do our little foldy thing on the corner. So because I've got a 5-inch square template, I could just place that, finger press my centres and place that to draw around it, but it may not be something you already have a template for, so I thought I'd just show you how to mark to get the corners in place. So I'm just going to mark in 2 inches in, because that will end up giving me a 5-inch square in the middle, which is exactly what I want. So on my ruler here, I'm just going to line up my 2-inch line with the edge of my fabric, and I'm just going to draw a line. I've got a mechanical pencil here, and what I'm really looking for is an intersect line. I don't really need that line, although it will be helpful when we're pressing the edges in. It's more that I need the corners marked to help us with making those nice mitered corners. So I'm on the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm just lining up that 2-inch with the edge of my square. So I'm going all 4 sides. And so what that now gives me is a nice 5-inch square. I can check that I'm right. I can pop my 5-inch square on there, and it sits very nicely in there, which is exactly what we're looking for. So I wanted this line here. Now on a square, I want the diagonal line that will help me. We're going to trim the corners off. What we're trying to achieve is something that looks like this. So I've already marked my square and I've trimmed my corners. But to make sure that these cuts are at the right angle and that we haven't skewed them, it helps to have a diagonal line. So that's fine on a square, we could finger press that. What about if it's on a rectangle or something else and it's a little bit harder to do? So I would suggest that you could just draw a line through so that you've got something to line up with, and I'm just going to come all the way through on this one because it's only small. But on a longer, like a placemat or something like that, you would need to do it at the ends, and you wouldn't be able to go all the way through the corners because this corner would be over here somewhere. So I've got my diagonal line marked now. That's just to help me with cutting, because I want to trim those corners off now so that we can do our little mitered seam. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to line up one of my lines on the ruler with my diagonal, and where we intersect here, we want to cut 1/4 inch away. So my 1/4 inch on my ruler line wants to come right over that point. So hopefully you're going to be able to see this. So I might use that dotted line, it's easier to see through. So I've got a line here going right the way through on the diagonal, and my 1/4 inch line is just slightly to one side, to the outside of that point. and that's going to give me basically a half square cut. But if I didn't line it up with my diagonal, it would be very easy to have it slightly skewed, and then you'll get a very wonky little mitre, and we don't want these mitres to be wonky. We have enough trouble with mitres. We don't need wonky mitres. So line your line up with that diagonal line, line your 1/4 inch up so that it's just slightly on the outside edge of that, and then we can cut that corner off. And we're going to do that to all 4 corners. So line up your line up your point, and trim that off. Line up the line, and it's a good thing we've only got 4 corners, isn't it? So line up the line up that 1/4 inch, and there, we don't need those triangles. So now I've got this wonderful shape. So this is going to sit around here, and we're going to be folding these in, and we're going to be sewing them down and things like that. So right now I'm going to do that pressing to get that edge in, so I'll bring the iron over. So what I want to do here is I want to press this edge to just on the outside of the drawn line that I've put in there when we did that 2 inches in. I don't want it right on the line, I want it to be just a little bit outside. That's because when I put my 5-inch square, as it happens to be, in there, it's got to come up and around that. You don't necessarily want it so tight that it bubbles the square inside. You could trim the square down a touch, is another option, but just not quite even 1/8 of an inch, just a little bit less than that line. Press those down, do them the same, keep it nice and even all the way around. This would be just the same on a rectangle for a placemat. If you wanted a smaller, more like a regular 1/2 inch binding that we often see on things, then that's possible. It's just a little bit more fiddly because everything is just smaller. So I've done that now, so hopefully you can see that this edge is sitting just on the outside a little bit from the line. So what we're going to do now is turn it so that we're putting right sides together and line up these nice pressed edges, and we're going to stitch along this edge here, this line here, so 1/4 of an inch along. So you're not stitching, you're stitching just through the little fold, but it's on this little unfolded edge that we're stitching along there. So I'll go to the sewing machine now. So regular 1/4 inch seam allowance, start from this point here and come along, and it should come right through that point where we drew, or ever so slightly to the right of it. And I would suggest that you backstitch, I've gone a bit far, but backstitch that little edge because that's going to be your corner, and then do a little backstitch before you cut your threads off at that end as well. And you can trim those, because you backstitched, that's locked it in. And then we're going to do the same thing on all 4 of those corners. So I'm just going to go through and do that. So we're starting here, finishing here. Little back stitch when you come onto the fabric. Little back stitch before you come off. This is kind of fun. It's not as hard as it looks once you get started. Here's the last one. So you could be chain piecing if you were making a set. You could do several at a time. So that's the last corner done. So exciting, doesn't take long. Trim off any threads now because we've locked stitched everything in. And so what we're going to do now, we've got this very funny shaped little thing, very cute. So what we need to do is turn those out, No, first of all we want to just trim off, apart from the threads, we want to trim just in the little corners, so not into your stitching, but just so that that little bulk of corner fabric isn't going to be there when we push these little points out. So it's just a tiny little trim on the corners. And now we want to turn those out the right way. So you want to push that corner out. You may want a little point turner to help you with that. They want to come out nicely and nice and sharp. So if you need something to help push those corners out, although these have come out pretty well, just something a little bit pointy, not too sharp. These scissors are probably a touch sharp for this. You can get little point turners. They work very nicely. And now I'm going to press that so that everything's sitting just where we want it to. Those bits that we pressed in before should be sitting in. We should have some nice mitered corners here. So just make sure things are sitting nicely and give that a bit of a press so that the next stage is made a bit easier by doing this pressing now. So now I've got a nice little pocket here and I want to insert this. So just make sure that it hasn't come up too small so that this isn't going to bubble up inside. I have a feeling that this is going to be a touch tight, so I'm just going to trim my square down just a little bit, maybe 1/8 of an inch on two sides, and it just helps it fit in just that little bit better. We could have made the edges slightly different, but I've done it this way. I would rather trim it down now and know that it's going to fit. Okay, so now we're going to, if this was already quilted, of course it would be a little bit more solid than it is with just the batting. You could also do a little applique, you could get lots of things going on here, but we want to put this inside those corners now. So pop your little corner into the corner, all the way around, have it sitting nice and flat. We're actually nearly done. So that's sitting pretty well. Make sure that everything's sitting nice and flat in those, under those edges. I'm just going to iron it again so that everything is sitting nicely. And as I said, on a coaster this size, everything's kind of nice and easy. On something a little bit larger like a placemat, some of these edges might be wanting to bow out a little bit. So this is where you can make sure that they're pressed the way you want them to sit before we go and stitch it. So that's done. So if you were having something a little bit larger and you wanted to do some applique, you could actually do the applique through it so that it was quilting it at the same time. You could quilt it through as well. I'm just going to stitch this now. So what we're trying to do now is stitch just very close to the edge, like you would perhaps with a binding, and I think that that's going to work really nicely for us. So I'm coming in here and I'm not necessarily starting right at the corner. I just want to come in a little bit, so my foot's got a little edge on it that I'm going to line up with that and start sewing. Just going to do a little back stitch right up to the corner, and then I'm going to leave the needle down, lift the foot and pivot it around. Into the next corner. Lift the foot, pivot, then start sewing again. By doing all the pressing and things as we go, it makes this step much easier than if it was just a little bit wonky, trying to keep it all straight. You could put some pins in, particularly on a larger project, if it was wanting to wander out a little bit, just to keep the edges in nice and firm for you. And then just a little back stitch to finish, to lock those ends off. And as you can see, that's pretty much it done. I'm just going to give it one final press for no good reason other than I just like things that are nicely pressed. It's sitting nicely. My mitres are looking pretty good here. I've got some nice straight lines going on. The corners are sitting well, it's sitting nice and flat. What more could you want? You could have done a little applique in there, you could make it larger, you could make the binding narrower. I've made a little set here. What a wonderful little gift for people. These are little mug mats, and I've done this one with the 1/2 inch binding. And so I've done exactly the same technique as on here, except that I've pre-quilted my fabric first. I had a fat quarter and I quilted the whole fat quarter, then I cut it up into pieces already quilted. And this one here I've just used, I've just added 1 inch all the way around because I only wanted a 1/2 inch binding on those ones. That was a little bit fiddlier to sew the corners, but really it was exactly the same technique, and I did need a couple of clips just to hold that on to keep that nice and straight when I was ready to sew it. Other than that, what a great little gift. You could just tie things up with a little ribbon, or you might want to give yourself a gift. You might need some coasters for wherever you're going in your RV. We've just got a nice big camper bus. We're going to need some things like that. We might need to give ourselves some little gifts. But a great way to do this sort of binding where you're bringing the fabric to the front, but you're already pre-mitering your corners. So I hope that's another idea for you, and thank you.